Hello, this is part 3 of the Origin of Eukaryotes lecture. So we've mentioned now that the mitochondria, the event that led to the first mitochondrion being acquired from a heterotrophic bacterium, that must be very important to the story of how eukaryotes first evolved, right? But there are lots of different ways that that could happen. And so now what we're going to do is talk about some specific theories that attempt to explain exactly how this worked, complete with mechanisms and the order of events. Okay, so one theory, one set of ideas for how this happened is that there was some ancient eukaryotes a long, long time ago, perhaps even before the Great Oxidation Event, that did not have mitochondria. So to distinguish that from a true eukaryote, you could call it a proto-eukaryote. That is a pre-eukaryote, something that came before the eukaryotes, but something that was not archaea and not bacterial. And once it acquired a heterotrophic bacterium that became the mitochondria, that is what we now call the ancestor of all of the eukaryotes today. Okay, seems pretty intuitive, but that's not the only way it could have happened. Okay, so a second theory is that the original host of the bacterium that became the mitochondrion was a species of archaea. So the ancestor of the eukaryotes was in fact an archaeal cell that acquired a bacterial cell that became the endosymbiotic mitochondria, and that is what led to all of the eukaryotes that we know today. These are actually two pretty different theories, and let's talk about exactly why they are different and how they make different predictions about the biology that we can observe today. So let's take the first one. This first idea of the ancient eukaryotes actually comes from the standard 3-domain tree of life that was first proposed by Carl Woese using the sequences of the 16S ribosomal RNA gene. We've used this simplified tree of life before, and it's also a good example of what this first theory predicts that we should see, which is that the domain eukaryotes includes ancient ancestors that were alive before there were any mitochondria. And that is what is implied when you draw the tree of life in this way, where there were things that we would call eukaryotes that were evolving basically at the same time that the archaea were evolving, right? This speciation event that split the eukaryotes and the archaea from each other led to what is technically known as a stem group of eukarya, that is this long stem of eukaryotes, most of which are now extinct. Or maybe we just haven't discovered them yet. Maybe there's some weird microbial eukaryotes out there somewhere on Earth waiting to be discovered that will fill out this branch. But from what we have observed so far about the diversity of life on Earth right now, all of the diversity of eukaryotes basically evolved really, really recently. That's something that we're going to talk about later in this lecture. For now, just take my word for it that all of the diversity we see in the eukaryotes now is very recent. It all happened about the same time. And Woese's 3-domain tree of life predicts that there would have been ancestors of all of the eukaryotes we see today a long time ago that, for example, did not have mitochondria. Okay, so there should be mitochondria-less ancestors that did not have mitochondria for a long time before mitochondria were invented. Okay, and this is distinct from the second theory that I mentioned 2 slides ago, which is that the ancestor of the eukaryotes is an archaeal species, because this predicts that there were no eukaryotes whatsoever of any kind until there were mitochondria. That basically the acquisition of a heterotrophic bacterium to become the endosymbiotic mitochondria by an archaeal species was the thing that created the eukaryotes. And there were no ancient eukaryotic ancestors that were alive at the same time as the archaeal ancestors. There were only archaea and bacteria for most of the history of life on Earth, or at least half of it or so. There were only 2 domains, the archaea and the bacteria, and this very important event of the creation of the first mitochondria invented what we now call the 3rd domain of the eukaryotes. So these are pretty different ideas, right? One says that there basically have always been 3 domains, or at least there have been 3 domains for a very long time. There have been bacteria, eukarya, and archaea for a very long time, and recently the eukaryotes also got mitochondria. Or for most of the history of life on Earth, there were only bacteria and archaea, and the eukaryotes are recent. Okay? Now we call this Loki's tree of life because this idea that the eukaryotes are a recent divergence from the archaeal domain received a lot of support very recently, in just the past few years, due to people discovering new microbes in weird places. So this is a place called Loki's Castle. It's a group of hydrothermal chimneys on the seafloor in the Arctic Ocean. So these are hydrothermal chimneys under the ice of the Arctic Ocean. So you can kind of think of it as a snowball Earth scenario on today's Earth. And when people went to these places and collected water samples and samples of these chimneys and brought them back to the lab and sequenced the DNA, even without growing them in the lab, they just sequenced the DNA straight from the environment, they noticed that there were some really weird archaeal groups that had never been found before, that when you place them on the tree of life, they look kind of like a transition between archaea and eukarya. And when you make a full tree of life, including these new Loki archaeota, as they're called because they came from Loki's castle, it looks more like that the eukaryotes are one branch within the archaea. And if you accept that as a valid observation, then you are left with the uncomfortable implication that the eukaryotes are really just one member of the archaea, and that the eukaryotes and archaea together form a monophyletic group. Or another way of saying it is that the Loki archaeota are a sister group to the eukarya, and you can't include the Loki archaeota as members of the archaea unless you also include the eukarya. And if you accept that, then you can think of all of the tree of life as really just 2 domains instead of 3 domains. Right? So that's a pretty big implication of these 2 different ideas. Idea number 1 is consistent with Wose's 3 domains. Idea number 2 is consistent with Loki's 2-domain tree, where there are really only 2 domains and the eukaryotes are members within the archaea. Okay, so there are many more ideas about the origin of eukaryotes. It's a very popular topic for people to speculate about, so there are many, many theories. We're going to talk about one more. So the third hypothesis or theory, depending on how much evidence you think is supporting it, you can call it a hypothesis or a theory, because this definitely does not rise to the level of, for example, the theory of evolution, which has tons and tons and tons of evidence behind it, and so it's a very, very strong theory. So maybe hypothesis is a better term for these ideas that we're talking about. So this third hypothesis that we're going to talk about is a fusion event. So instead of thinking about the archaeal species acting as a host for a symbiotic bacterial cell becoming a mitochondrion, this idea predicts that there was a fusion event where an archaeal cell and a bacterial cell fused, 2 cells became 1 cell, and their genomes actually fused together as well, forming a chimeric genome, or a genome composed of both archaeal and bacterial parts. And so then you could draw the 3-domain tree instead of as a purely tree-like hierarchical structure. Instead, you can draw what has been called the ring of life, where the eukarya are being drawn as the fusion of lineages that come together and fuse like this. Okay, so it's not really a proper tree anymore. And the best evidence for this idea comes from sequencing genomes of eukaryotes. And if you look at the genes of eukaryotes, some of them are unique, so you only ever find them in eukaryotic genomes. Some of them look like bacteria, and some of them look like archaea. So if in a very rough glance at eukaryotic genomes, you see some genes that look like they are derived from bacteria. You see some genes that look like they are derived from archaea. Here are 2 different examples. This is a yeast. This is a red algae. You roughly get the same answer in most organisms you look at from the eukarya. And this is consistent with the idea that the genomes of these ancient archaeal and bacterial cells fuse together. So that's the strongest evidence for this idea. So those are our 3 hypotheses, and I would say that there is not a strong consensus among scientists today about which of these ideas is correct. Wose's 3-domain tree, I think, is the default, that that's the king, and it takes a lot to bring the king down because there's so much evidence behind the idea that there are 3 domains. Loki's tree is experiencing a moment of popularity right now due to these recent discoveries of the Loki archaeota. And it's one that the textbook that we're using has already adopted, and I was quite surprised that they adopted it so quickly because this is really a recent discovery. But there you go. Then the Ring of Life also has its fans and its proponents, and does explain some of the observations of life today. So these three different hypotheses have pretty big implications for how we can think about our own history. So do we belong to an ancient lineage that has remained separate from both the archaea and bacteria for billions of years? Have there been ancient eukaryotes almost as long as there have been archaea and bacteria? Or are we recent? Have there been nothing like eukaryotes until very recently when some archaeal cell decided to turn a bacterium into a mitochondrion, and that was very recent? Or are we a fusion of bacteria and archaea, and we can think of ourselves as a grand synthesis of the best of archaea and the best of bacteria fused into one super being? Yeah. So those are the three big implications of these three different hypotheses about the origin of mitochondria and how that led to the first eukaryotes. So, question. Is this tree that we have also shown previously in class, is this more consistent with an ancient lineage of eukaryotes that have been separate from the other two domains for a long time? Or is this more like a recent divergence of the eukaryotes from within one group of the archaea? Or is this showing a fusion of the archaea and the bacteria? Pause the video, think about it. And the answer is A. This is a standard 3-domain tree of life, very similar to the one we showed earlier. You've got a clear bacterial domain, a clear archaeal domain, a clear eukaryotic domain that is just as ancient as the archaeal domain. This is representing a speciation event that split the ancient archaea and the ancient eukaryotes from each other, consistent with 3 domains and consistent with ancient eukaryotes that must have been alive for a long time before there were any mitochondria. Okay. So where on this tree would be the oldest eukaryotic ancestor that definitely had mitochondria? Think about that for a second. And the answer would be here. This ancestor at this node of the tree would include all of the groups of the eukaryotes that we know about today. And I told you earlier that all of the groups of eukaryotes we know about today include mitochondria. Therefore, their common ancestor must have also had mitochondria. And it's possible that ancestors of eukaryotes before this node, so somewhere along the stem, might have had mitochondria. We don't know. But at some point, there must have been a eukaryote that did not have mitochondria, that was representing the ancient eukaryotes that existed before they acquired mitochondria. That is a prediction of this tree, and is not true with other theories about the origin of eukaryotes, but the way this tree is drawn, there must have been eukaryotes without mitochondria, then they got mitochondria, and that led to the eukaryotes that we see today. Good. See you in part 4.